Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Creating a Presentation for a Liturgical Worship Service. My name is Peter Frank and I will be leading the presentation today. I am the Senior Manager of Marketing Technology here at Concordia Publishing House. I've been with our team here for over 11 years. I've been with, or I should say with the Publishing House for 11 years, with our marketing team for about 6 or so, and with the Lutheran Service Builder team for about 2.5 years. So that means that I haven't been involved during most of the development of the new online Lutheran Service Builder, which we'll be showing today. Now, my contact information is on the screen. Email is always the best way to get a hold of me, but my phone number is there too, and then I'll go straight to my office phone, which will right now take you to voicemail. So don't try calling it right now, but I'm not often in my office, so feel free to leave a message. Otherwise, if you email me, I usually get back pretty quickly. So a little bit about the housekeeping items before we get too far. First off, I am planning 50 minutes for this presentation. I may go over that. I notoriously go over that. So that's okay as long as we don't have too many questions. My plan is for 10 minutes for questions. Now, I like to kind of watch the queue as we go through the presentation and know exactly how many questions we have. So I ask you to ask questions throughout. That'll let me know how much time I really need to dedicate to the questions at the end. And if we have too many questions, I'll usually go over that hour by about 5 or 10 minutes to answer those questions. You are certainly welcome to stay even if you didn't ask. But we'll see how it goes today. We might get everything done in 50 minutes and have enough time for questions. So we are recording this webinar and we will be sharing it later on. My goal is to get it out still today to you so that you can rewatch anything or share it with somebody else at your congregation. Now, this is a webinar where I am the only presenter, and so you are all muted, but that's why we have the questions so you can ask that. I am going to take out my headphones because while I get the webinar instructions at the beginning, nothing else comes across during the webinar. So that's why I take those out. It always feels a little awkward having those in. So Lutheran Service Builder, that's what we're going to be talking about today, or that's what we're going to be using. The focus will be on creating a presentation, but the tool that we'll be using is Lutheran Service Builder. If you are not familiar with it, Lutheran Service Builder is a web-based program that allows churches to quickly and easily plan services, create custom worship bulletin interiors, export presentations, which we're talking about today, as well as playlists. And it also helps you conform with copyright requirements throughout those other three. So we have three major types of exports. We have those bulletin interiors, which is typically what you think of when you think of Lutheran Service Builder, or at least many of the churches that I have worked with think of it from just a bulletin builder kind of creation. But it's not just that. That's why we call it Service Builder, because bulletins are a portion of it, but it's really all about the service. And how you export it depends on the needs of your congregation. So that's why today we're talking about presentations. And to my knowledge, there has never been a training session purely dedicated to presentations. So you get to be here for the first one. Hopefully it'll meet your expectations. That's my goal. All right, now I always assume things about my audience before I get started because it helps plan the webinar. And typically with Lutheran Service Builder presentations or webinars, I'm assuming the same things. So if you've been in one of my recent webinars, you probably have heard this. I'm assuming you understand the basics of the liturgy. This is not a training webinar on how the liturgy works, what the different parts are. I'll mention some terms that may not be familiar to you if you don't understand the liturgy. That's not the end of the world. I'm just assuming that you do, so I'm not going to be explaining it all. Now, I am assuming you're new to the online Lutheran Service Builder, and that's a pretty safe assumption because it just came out this summer. If you have been using it for the last couple months, you will definitely pick up some new things today, because not everything I'm talking about is about Builder. It's going to go into presentations in a broader sense too. If you're one of our field testers who have been using it since the beginning of the year, well, you may pick up even less because you're so familiar with it. But my assumption is that those of you who are here are fairly new to it. And I think that's a pretty safe assumption. Now this one, I'm also assuming you have a subscription or a free trial. This, I don't know if it's a safe assumption. And when I say subscription, I mean to the new version. You might be using Lutheran Service Builder 2, or you might not be using them at all. But it's always best to follow along with the presentation. And if you've got 2 monitors, that works out great. Otherwise, you may want to flip back and forth. But if you don't have a subscription right now, a free trial will get you most of what we're going to talk about today. And you can get a free trial at LutheranServiceBuilder.com. And I'll leave that up there on the screen for those of you who want to go and start it. It's no payment or anything required up front. You get access to just about everything in Lutheran Service Builder, with the exception of exporting. And obviously exporting is a big part of that, but that starts to get into usage and copyrights and all of that. That's why we charge for that part moving forward. But as a service planner, as reviewing the liturgy, reviewing different hymns, you can get most of it just with your free trial. It just doesn't get that practical application of exporting, which again is very important. All right, so we've got a nice group here today. I'd love to hear a little bit about yourselves and what role you have in the church, as well as if you're using Builder or not. So my first, let me go back, there we go. My first question, if you don't mind answering this as a poll, is to select the option that most closely describes your primary role at church. And I know many of you have multiple roles, you wear many hats in the church. Just pick your primary one. This will give me a good idea of who is here today. So looks like we've got about 3/4 voted. Okay, it's going up now. All right, I'll leave it for just another second or so. Okay, all right, I'm going to share this with you so you can see what we've got today. We have about 21% are pastors, 57% are administrators, no musicians here at all, which is a little surprising. Typically, it's not a large number. Because a lot of what Service Builder does is on the actual preparation side. Then we've got 7% called church workers and 14% others. So for those of you who are other, I'd be curious to know what role you have in the church. So feel free to put that in the questions. That'll just help give me a better idea and more satisfy my curiosity. All right, let's close that. And then I'm going to ask this question. Are you currently using, and I should have put online, are you currently using the online version of Lutheran Service Builder in your congregation? This will help me know if you're already active and up and running with it, if you're considering it, or where we're at. All right, good. It looks like over 80% are, okay, right around, oh, now it's changing. All right, about 70% are using it, 30% are not, or are planning to soon. So thank you very much for that. All right, now I'm going to jump back over here. So the outline for today is to first plan a service, then we'll select the elements. And those are two different things. It's very different processes in the new version than it is in version 2. So we're going to plan service, select the elements, edit the formatting, and actually I'm going to go back there. We're going to kind of do those two interchangeably because there's a lot of formatting I want to show. But I want to give an understanding of the formatting before we get too far with selecting the elements, because you've got to make some decisions along the way based on how it displays. It's a lot different doing a presentation than an actual bulletin because you have far more breaks, meaning you have multiple slides. So you might have 30, 50, 60 slides or more in a presentation for a 12, 15, 18 page bulletin, or maybe even less. So it's a little bit of a different approach, and there's going to be some probably more modifications after the export with a presentation than with a bulletin. So we'll cover those, but it's going to be important to get those two things kind of together at the same time. And lastly, we'll export the content. And we're not going to get into that a whole lot, mainly because the bulk of the work is done in Builder. There's a little bit afterwards, and we've got two types of exports. We're going to focus on the PowerPoint, which is by far the more popular one, but we'll talk about MediaShout too. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to switch my screen and go right to the front screen of Builder. And one of the things I like to do on the webinar, because I know you're looking at it kind of in a window on your screen, is to zoom in, because it can be hard to see. Now, I like to bring this up because many of you have said, well, the font size is so small. Well, you can zoom in on your computer too if you'd like. If you hit Control and then the scroll mouse, or Control and then plus or minus, you can adjust the zoom. And Lutheran Service Builder is responsive, which means it should still look good. Not all websites look good when you zoom in, but we have built Builder to be able to do that. So go ahead and give that a try if you're interested. But today I'm going to focus on the 21st Sunday after Pentecost. the upcoming October 14th. So what I'll do is I'll click on that day in the church year, and it takes me to the propers for the day. Now, this is part of what we called previously Lutheran calendar, so this is not anything new. It's probably new if you're only on version 2, but you can see all the propers listed. Right now, it's just a great reference, but from here, you can go and plan this service. And again, all of this is available in the free trial if you're starting that up. So the service plan takes the propers, or the readings for the day at least, and applies them and says, we're assuming you're going to use these readings, but go ahead and plan out your service. So a service plan is just that. It's a plan, it's not a service. There's many elements missing from the plan, but this is at a high level. So you can plan weeks or months in advance and alter it as you go. But we're assuming that you're using the lectionary, and the lectionary can be set up in settings. So if you're using the 1 year or the 3 year, you can choose which one and get the appropriate readings. So we'll stick with these readings for today, but you could always add additional readings. Now, I should clarify that this process here for service plan is the same whether you are preparing a bulletin or a presentation or both. We're going to take the approach that you're just planning a presentation today, but we're still going to be in here. So I can go in and add any additional readings if I wanted to. So let's say John 3:16. I can go in and see, all right, well, here's where that verse is used in readings on different days in the church year. And there's a number of them. Pentecost evening, Holy Trinity, Lent 2, Lent 4, each one of the different lectionaries, A, B, and C for Pentecost evening. But there's different groupings. So some are 3:1 to 17, some are 3:16 to 21, or if I just want to use John 3:16, I can put that too. So it gives you some additional context. Now, that's pretty straightforward, but that process is similar for hymns, and that's what we're going to plan out next. So I'm going to add a hymn. Actually, I'm going to add several hymns. The hymn screen, the hymn selection, comes over on the right-hand side, just like where the readings came over, but it's divided differently. The first thing for this is the hymn of the day, which is like a proper for your service. So the hymn of the day for Pentecost 21 is "Thee will I love, my strength, my tower." So we'll select that. Now, we don't often have a service with only one hymn, so we'll add some more. The next section here is hymns for the readings. These are the readings assigned for this day in the church year. I should clarify that if you change the readings, these suggestions do not change. It's always going to be the readings for that day in the church year, or hymns related to the readings for that day in the church year. I can understand where that might cause some problems, and you can certainly search for hymns based on other readings other than what the lectionary has assigned. But this is just that grouping that's selected for today. So we'll add a couple hymns from here. And actually, I'm going to add, these are the Holy 10 Commandments, or commands. I'll show you that one in a few moments. And then you can also add hymns that are other suggested hymns. Now, these are hymns that are based on the themes for that day in the church year, not necessarily the readings. And our music team has selected these. These are the same that go into the worship planning book. Now, it used to be in Lutheran Service Builder 2, we had other suggested hymns, but those were different than the worship planning book. We've aligned those now. That was based on our feedback from our congregations using our resources. They suggested we do that. All right, so we'll add another hymn there. Below that then is the order of service. And we can pick the order of service, again, from this selection. And I always choose to go with Divine Service Setting 1 for my webinars because it's consistent for me. So hopefully that works for you. I know everybody uses kind of different services and different settings for different times, but we'll go with that for today. Now you'll notice that we've selected the order of service independently from the hymns. What we did is we said we're going to use these 4 hymns and we'll decide how later on. So even though I've selected the hymn of the day, it hasn't necessarily been inserted as the hymn of the day, right before the sermon. We haven't selected the the hymn to open and hymn to depart. Those are just there as options. And then finally, you've got two optional things here. Additional rites, so maybe you're adding a baptism or a confirmation or an installation, you can mark that here. That doesn't necessarily change your service, but it's a good place to store that and say, okay, well, we have 3 additional rites, so maybe we'll try not to have too many longer hymns today, something like that. And then for anything else that you want to keep track of in your notes, or if for your service, you put in your notes. So I always like to suggest putting, Pastor Smith is preaching, something along those lines. Maybe the children's choir is singing at 10:30, something like that. That is what we call the service plan. So you remember in the outline I said we're going to plan a service, then choose elements. Sure, there's a few elements we selected like the readings and the hymns, but for the most part, that's just what we're planning on doing, the kind of the bones of the structure. Now we'll fill in the rest. Normally, I would go to prepare bulletin. And if you are doing both a bulletin and a presentation, I would suggest going to the bulletin first, because a lot of the decisions you make in the bulletin will then flow over into the presentation. And I personally feel like the interface for the bulletin, by its very nature, is easier to understand. And that's because it's a little bit more condensed. When we get into presentations, you have all the individual slides. So that's my kind of dividing line there. If you are only doing presentation, no need to prepare a bulletin. But if you're doing both, I'd suggest starting with the bulletin. All right, we're going to start with presentation though. So I'll click prepare presentation and it will load, and it takes a second. That's one of the things to watch for with presentations, because depending on how much additional graphics and things you utilize, whether a background image or different fonts and styles, it might take a few seconds longer. It's not going to be like the dial-up days where you're waiting and wait and go get a cup of coffee or anything like that, but it may take a few seconds. And that's a combination of factors of file size and internet speed and browser selection. So just a word of caution. But now we are on the presentation screen, and you can see there's a few elements or a few aspects of this. Element is a reserved term. A few aspects of this I want to draw your attention to. First off, you have the ribbon at the top, and you'll start with the document and the insert tabs there. Those will always be present for you. On the document, you have the presentation format, and you can go and edit it. We're going to go there in just a moment. And then you have the order of service, and you can change the order of service from this. Now, we selected it during the service plan. If you don't select it during the service plan, this is the first thing you need to select on the presentation view, but doesn't mean you're locked into it. You can change it if you'd like. So maybe instead of Divine Service Setting 1, you want to go to the Service of Prayer and Preaching. You'll get this notification that it will replace any changes you've made to the service. As you can imagine, if you understand the liturgy, this is a pretty drastic change. So I'm going to go ahead and click continue. And there we go. So now you'll see everything else has changed. So we're going to actually go back to the or Divine Service Setting 1, just because that's the one I'm most familiar with, and it'll make for a better presentation for you guys today. But I did want to show that you can change that. The Insert tab here allows you to insert elements that are not part of that order of service, but are appropriate to put in here. So when you click Insert, you have these lines that appear in your slides. So we'll look at that in a little while, but I wanted to show you what these two tabs are up here. Now next, we're going to look down the main work area. You see on the left-hand side, very similar to how PowerPoint or many of the other presentation software does it, you get a preview of the slide, and then you get the slide itself. And they're all divided up for you right here. Now when you click on a slide, you're actually clicking on an element because they're divided with one element per slide. And that's a good way of doing it, because you can only put so much on a slide. It's not like you're doing a training or educational session. You are doing a worship service where we are all participating. And so you can't expect people to participate as easily if there's a lot on every slide. So we'll go down here to the confession of sins. That's quite a bit. That's probably the max. Now, for many of these things, you have this balance of, okay, that's a lot on one slide. Do I divide it up under 2 or 3? And then how many times am I clicking? So you have this kind of balance act of putting enough on each slide, not too little so that you have to keep progressing forward, and not too much that it's hard to consume all of that. And it depends on your audience too. If you have an audience who are used to things, maybe a younger audience who are used to looking at screens versus an older audience who did not grow up with this kind of screen in their life, they might have a harder time adjusting to it. So that's a call for your church, but we'll get into that in a little bit more. Going back to the hymn of invocation, when you select this, this is an element. And so this single element shows up here at the top. Hymn of invocation shows in the ribbon. And you can select this now. So if I go and select my hymn of invocation from over here, let's say I want to say, take my life and let it be. Now this hymn has been selected and all my slides change. In fact, it doesn't even say hymn of invocation anymore, but it's added slides. So there's the first stanza, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. There's a lot of stanzas here. Now you can change the way that this is displayed. So maybe you don't want all 6 stanzas. You can go under this element, which now has the hymn name as opposed to hymn of invocation, and additional things. So you have like stanzas. So maybe we only want to do 1, 3, 5, and 6. You can take those out. You might want to say, well, I don't need the title of the hymn on each slide. They get the idea. It's take my life and let it be. So you can go over here to this title option and say, only put it on the first. And then you have it on the first slide and not the ones after that. Or maybe you want it on a completely separate slide and you just say, separate it out. This is the hymn we're gonna sing. Now we sing it. So that's what that button there does, is it shows it to you, and you can also remove it. I would not suggest removing it entirely, at least not for hymns. There's going to be some other elements in here where you might want to do that. Now you can also choose how the music is displayed. In fact, I'm going to go back and put this on first so that it's there next to the first stanza. You can say, instead of just showing the text, show the melody. And I'll click melody, and it'll display that. Now, a word of caution, and this is a personal preference, but I've heard this from many different people in the church. It is harder to read the melody on a presentation for 2 main reasons. One, there's a lot of actual black space on here. So when you think about a slide, and it might be inverted, we'll talk about styles in a minute, but in terms of the actual writing on there, there's a lot to consume, and it's not like a printed piece where you choose when you start looking and when you stop. With a presentation, somebody else is choosing for you. So that's one thing. There's a lot to take in and a limited amount of time. The other thing, though, is that the way that music works, where you engrave it, where you put, or our editors put the music next to the lyrics, to the words there, that is all a very precise thing, which means that these are all images to start, which means you can't change the font size, you can't change the font style. All you can do is invert it between black and white, and that makes it difficult. So you can do this. In most cases, I've heard it's not as good, but we put it as an option because some people still prefer it. And depending on your screen size and everything, it might be just fine. It might be large enough, and you can stay on it long enough that it's not overwhelming. Again, that's a preference. My recommendation is to use text. One of the questions we get, well, why can't you make the font larger? Well, it just depends on how it's engraved, because you can see here, like down in this last part of the stanza, filled with, are fairly close together, more so than like lips and let. There's spacing there. So while we could increase the font size in some, you'd have to essentially re-engrave everything. And because it's an art and not a science, it can't be automated. So it's a very manual process, and it's just not something that we can do automatically. So I'm going to switch this back to text and get off my soapbox on hymns for a little while. Let's move on to another element. So here's the invocation. You can see how it changes up here in the ribbon. That is different. We'll have exhortation, we'll have confession of sins, we have a second slide there. You'll notice that this one is indented, just like the hymn was, it was indented there. This is indented because it's a continuation of the same element, and that gives you a visual cue. Now, when the presentation is done, you won't see any different. But this is one of those ones where you might want to say, well, I don't think we need the title on both. We'll just put it on the first one. So confession of sins leads to this, and then you have the absolution. Now, you might not want to put the caption on everything. So confession of sins and absolutions is the proper way of calling each of those elements. But some churches, many churches actually, I've seen it many different times, will combine those two, and it'll say confession and absolution. And so rather than having absolution down here, you would just take that off and say none. And maybe you change this. We'll talk about changing text in just a minute. So it just flows together, one thing right after the next. And that's how it's going to happen anyways. You're not going to say absolution of sins or absolution, how Almighty God in his mercy. So it just is a matter of your preferences. Now, I personally like having the captions in to teach people about the liturgy. I think there's a lot of value to be gained in knowing exactly what you're doing at that time, although some of the words are not as straightforward as confession of sins. Even absolution is not a word we use in our English language. And so maybe it's not the time to teach. It just depends on your congregation and how you want to explain the liturgy. But what I do want to show, and I'm going to put the caption back up here again, is that we've got some different element options now. So confession based on the divine service setting 1 is always going to be in there. But under absolution, you might not have absolution there. You know, we certainly want to declare God's forgiveness, but it might not be a pastor who is leading the service. At my church, we have a vicar, and on the services where we don't have communion on Saturday nights, pastor might take the evening off and let the vicar lead the service if he's preaching. And so in that case, rather than absolution, we'll have the declaration of grace, because the vicar is not a called and ordained servant of the word. He is a vicar, and so he proclaims or declares grace as opposed to absolve sin. Very theological implications there, of course, but practical implications for the presentation too. So we have this little option box to the left-hand side. It's blue with an arrow, and when you click it, it expands, and then you can click which elements you want. And you'll see this again and again throughout the services. Depending on the liturgy or this order of service you've selected, there may be more or fewer. But absolution, declaration of grace, you just select it here, and then it collapses once you've had that choice and hides the other options. So here's another example right away. You have the intro is available, or you could do the psalm with an antiphon, or you can do an entrance hymn. Once you select the entrance hymn, then that element changes to an entrance hymn, and you can select it over here. So that is another option for you. So let me pause there. I've gone into elements quite a bit, but there's things that are missing that are not as critical to the order of service, but might be important for you. So you'll notice as we're going through here, and I said I was going to kind of do these at the same time. You'll notice as we're going through here, we don't have anything like rubrics. We don't have any please sit, please stand, anything like that. You also don't have any headings. That is all based on the formatting. So let's take some time and go look at formattings, and we'll come back here in a moment. So under document, you've got presentation format and basic right now. If you click on edit, you're going to go to bullet or presentation formats. You can also go up here to the top right under the settings and go down to presentation formats. This button here and this button over by edit take you to the same place. So we'll click on presentation formats, and now we're in an entirely different screen. On the left-hand side, you have all of your different presentation format options. There are 2 by default, and then these other 3 I've added. We'll take a look at those in a bit. But the First one is basic, and this is the one that we've been seeing, and this is the one we're going to modify right now before we get all fancy with styles. So this is your basic format. Literally, it's called basic. And if you look over on the far right, you have three formatting options. You have style, which in the web design world would be your style sheet. Often in the print world, you have style sheets that say, okay, this is the order that we follow. These elements are this color and this size and this font. That's exactly what this is. Then you have the layout, which is saying the actual size of the PowerPoint and the margins on each side. So in this case, we have our height and width, and then top, bottom, left, right margins. So it's a smaller presentation, 768 by 1024. Most screens these days are larger, so it's important to keep that in mind, what screen you're projecting on. And it's not the actual size of the screens. You might have a really big screen that's 6 feet wide or something like that. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the DPI, or the pixels, the size of that, the resolution of that monitor or screen. All right, then we have the content. And this is really what I wanted to focus on right now before we get into those others. We'll talk about those others in a little bit. But the content formats determines what displays and how it's displayed within the order of service. So for example, headings. You'll notice there was no headings calling out what part of the service you're in. If we add headings here to visible, now you'll have a section called Confession and Absolution and Service of the Word, Service of the Sacrament. So we'll leave that in there for right now. And then there's also rubrics. Rubrics are the letters in red, which is not red here. We'll talk about that in a little while. But those tell the congregation or teach them the actions. It's instructions, really, I think is what it actually means, is instructions. So the sign of the cross may be made by all in the remembrance of their baptism. That's not usually spoken in the bulletin or in the hymnal. You'll see that in little red letters, and it's just a reminder of what you can do. Well, it becomes a little dicey as you get into presentations, because you don't want to put every little rubric on there. It's not necessary, because sometimes during the order service, there's going to be longer rubrics, and you don't want that to be on the screen for everybody. So you'll have to be careful, but for now, we're going to keep those in there. Now, the other stuff are defaults. So the next thing here is the hymn. Let's go down to, whoops. I skipped the hymn. There we go. This, by the way, this is an example service. It'll be the same regardless of the format. It's kind of predetermined that it's going to be this one here. So under hymns, you can say, well, do we even show hymns, or do we just tell people to go to the bulletin? Well, I would make the case that yes, you should show hymns. You should show everything. Don't do part on presentation and part on bulletins and part hymnal. That gets confusing. Put it all up there in your presentation. So keep those visible. And you can say, well, we always want it to be the melody, or you could say we always want it to be the text. I recommend text for hymns, but you don't have to. Then you can have the default caption placement like we talked about before. Do you want it on every slide, first slide, a separate slide? Put it on a separate slide. Remember, that's where the title is here on the first slide, and then everything else follows. I like to put it on the first slide. That's my personal preference. It takes up fewer slides that way. And then you can have the caption format, where maybe it's not the name of the hymn, but it's the role, the hymn of invocation. Or you could do both, role and name. Then finally, stanza numbers. And I used to wonder, well, why would you not want the stanza numbers? Doesn't it help? Well, you might not want it if you have a very long hymn and you're picking several different stanzas. You may not want to show those stanza numbers, so you can turn that off here too. Notice when you turn that off, it removes the indent, and that's kind of nice as well. All right, now you have all the liturgy, and you can say, well, the liturgy doesn't need to be visible. Well, that kind of defeats the purpose. I would say, yeah, put the liturgy visible. And again, you can choose whether you want the melody or the setting in there in appropriate circumstances like this. Here's the Kyrie with the setting, with the melody. I say just go with text. Because again, when it's music, it's an image. You can't adjust the size or change the font or anything. And then finally, caption placement every slide or first slide. I would recommend going first slide again. Finally, you've got your propers. So things like the readings. You could say, well, don't include those. Again, kind of defeats the purpose. You can say, okay, for propers like the gradual, oops, actually, no, the gradual is not. Here we go. There's the readings. You could put the melody where applicable. Again, I would say the text, but you can also have, in some instances, the setting. So I'm going to say text, and then you got the caption placement as well. And again, I like first slide. These are my preferences. Caption format, name, role, or name. Sometimes I like the role and name, although it can get lengthy in some cases, but it really creates a teaching aspect. Okay, this is the Holy Gospel. You have some other things like chant pointing and verse numbers. So the chant pointing are these pipes in here, and the little asterisks, you can remove those if you are just reading it out loud. And then you've got, once again, numbers for verses, like similar to stanzas. You may not want to include them. You can show the headings. These are the headings within the scripture from the ESV Bible, and then the words of Christ in red. I would actually recommend against that unless your PowerPoint or your background supports that. If it's white, that works. If it's red, that doesn't work at all. So something just to keep in mind. So I'm going to take these off. And now I'm going to save this. And I will close out of presentation formats and go back to the service. All right, now you can see we've got more in our presentation. There's confession and absolution. There's the hymn of invocation with the hymn name on it. All of these have been updated. You see my stanzas numbers are gone. The rubrics are still there. This is where I think having kind of that dual timing of elements and formats kind of work together. And this is the first time you're doing it. Once you create a format that works for you, you may just use that again and again, and your defaults will all be in place. So that's something to keep in mind, that this is going to take longer the first time. It's not going to be like that every service. All right, now let's talk about some things with these other ones. So you might want to keep those headings in, or you might not want to. If you don't want any of them in, then change your format. But if you want to leave some, you can actually override these elements. And you say, okay, well, I'm going to delete this heading, just this heading, and that's gone. And for this hymn of invocation, we're going to just say that it's not going to show at all. We're just going to start singing. I don't like that. We'll go with the first one. All right, we'll continue down here. Now you've got stand. Well, that's pretty, I don't know, blunt, if you will. Why don't we just add some manners to that and say, please stand. And the sign of the cross may be made in remembrance of their baptism. You might not want to include that. We'll just delete that. And so you can go through here and have these different things. Let's go down to, where was I going? I was going to go look for, here we go, the introit. So the introit, yeah, that's why I couldn't see it. Right now, you have the introit being read by the pastor, and then the doxology there, not doxology, the my words are failing me right now, but this Trinity statement there is in bold, meaning that it's spoken by all. What you can do here, though, is now if you're not chanting, you don't need the psalm tones, but you have this template up here, and this is kind of indicating who is saying what, and what is being said. In some cases, you can actually surround it, depending on the element. So you could say, well, I want the congregation to say the introit, and change it to that, or I want the pastor to say it and change it to that. And you've got the little symbol there that says who's speaking it. These are things that you can override in the individual service. All right. Oh man, I'm running out of time already, so I'm going to go a little bit faster. I hope I'm not going too fast already. So I think that's most of the elements that you can change here, or most of the types of elements. Certainly we're missing some things, like we don't have the hymn of the day, which we can pick right now. And you'll see the default format is applied. Under sermon, you can actually put the title if you wanted. You can type in here and change these things. All right. Finally, I know our service is not done, but I want to get into formats a little bit more. You'll notice that we've made some changes to this order of service. You can save those changes and reuse them again as a customized order of service. So I can go up here to right next to order of service and say save my divine service setting 1. Well, let's just change it and put it on here modified. Oops, modified, something like that. Now, these changes that you've made in terms of what you want displayed, saying please stand, the like, those will stay. Whereas the things that could change, the elements like the hymns or the readings, those will update based on the day in the church year. And so now when you're doing your service plan, we'll go back to the service plan, you could select under order of service, down here at the bottom, uncategorized, divine service setting 1 modified. You can choose that one. And you can make many more. That gets in, whoops, wrong direction. That gets into some more advanced stuff that we're not going to get into today. So we'll back to prepare presentation. And now I want to talk about the actual style. We've got about 20 minutes left, 10 minutes of presentation, although there are not a lot of different questions. So feel free to ask them. We'll get to those in a little bit. But I'm going to go to document and I'm going to go to edit because I'm in my basic format. But let's take a look at how we can modify this. So it's basic right now. And one thing to clarify is that sometimes you need to refresh the screen based on the size. And that's what we're going to do here. My screen size is 1920 by 1080. So 1080 height, 1920 pixels wide. I'm going to save that. And actually that came across just fine. But you'll notice, man, the text got really small in comparison. It's not that the text shrank, it's that the canvas grew. So now we can go through and start modifying some of the way these things look on an appropriate canvas. Well, the first thing I notice as we get into here is it's really tight along the edges. So if I go to layout, I'm going to change my margins to be, I don't know, 75. And they don't all have to be the same, but that's usually pretty nice. So that's not too bad. I could probably go a little more if I wanted to. But now let's start looking at how this appears. So under the Style tab, you can choose a background color or an image. So let's choose a color. And I'm going to go with kind of a dark navy color. There we go. Now, one thing that I prefer, and you'll see many different theories on this, although more often than not, it's said that a dark background with light text is easier to read in a presentation than the reverse. And I think that has to do with the brightness of a white background, making it harder to focus on black text. Whereas if you're reading a book, obviously you want the white background and the black text. There's not as much reflection on here, but because it's lit, it becomes bright. So that's my recommendation. If you do that, you'll have to change the font color, and we'll take care of that in just a moment. So I'm going to go with that kind of dark navy blue background, and then underneath that is sections. And you can have different sections. So the first one I want to go to is headings. That's the first one here. So the heading, we're going to click on the color underneath this. So right now under characters, it's a Verdana font, 52 points, bold, underline, and proper casing, or normal casing, sorry, and then a black color. I can move that to white, and that stands out much better. Now, I don't like doing underline in presentations unless it's just to emphasize a point. I don't like it for titles. Again, personal preference, but bold is good for heading, and sometimes all caps is even better. Now, I'm going to change the font. So under fonts, this is where it gets a little tricky. And it shouldn't be tricky because it's fonts. Everybody's used to changing fonts on an email or a Word document. Well, with a web application such as Lutheran Service Builder, you can only use the fonts that are on your computer. Now, that's true for word processors as well. But the difference with the browser is that the browser can't read what fonts are available on your computer. The programmers have to choose what fonts to give you. There's a whole story I could go into about web-ready fonts versus non-web-ready fonts, but regardless, our team has done their best to guess what fonts are on your computer. And that's usually based on what fonts you have used before if you've uploaded your database here, or what are standard for your operating platform. So for example, I'm on a Windows. Well, I'm going to have Arial. That's pretty much a given. Now, I might not have Helvetica or something like that. I'll probably have Calibri because that's standard on Windows computers. So you can pick which ones you want and just know that anything that you pick will display on your computer as long as it's installed, and most likely it will be. But whoever you share this with may not have that font on their computer. It's something to keep in mind as you're going through it. And most likely you'll pick a font for your presentations and stick with it. If your church has a style guide, that's an even better way of going. But let's go up and we'll do Calibri for right now. And now I'm going to change this and I'm going to say, well, I'd really like it to be larger. 72, let's go 96 and center it. And then you can do something like before and after. And there's not a lot of good things. You might do like the little curly, I forget what that's called. My grandpa called it the WYSIWYG, which I know is not what it is, but that's what I always think of when I say that. You could do little dashes, just make it a little style, or you might add a plus sign, make it look like a cross. Maybe add a space to separate it. You can do a number of little things, and all of your captions or all your headings will show like that. Now we'll go to body next. And this is really where you want to get it right. Now, right now we're at a 40-point font, but on this kind of resolution, that is really small. And I just made the text white to make it easier to read. And I'm going to make this Calibri as well, just to be consistent. And I will recommend you use 1 or 2 fonts at the most. Typically, you can get by with 1 font, 2 fonts if you want to be kind of stylish, but do not use more than that for presentation. It just gets harder and harder to distinguish what the purpose of each wording is when there's different fonts. And it doesn't work when you have 6, 7, 8 fonts. It becomes cluttered. I'll get off my soapbox on fonts though, but I know there's a lot of other people who are in communications who would agree with me. So let's see what it looks like at 72. That's not bad at all. I think I'll stick with 72. Now I'm going to go up to the captions, and we're going to switch that to Calibri as well. And I'm going to make that white as well, but it might be a little hard to distinguish. This is where I like to use something like italics, where it's there for your information, but you're not going to say it out loud, kind of like rubrics. We'll get to rubrics in a second. And so I'm going to make this a size 60 font, and that distinguishes it as something different. Now, while we're on the screen, you can see the copyright line on there. Down below, we'll do copyrights. I'm going to make that italics as well. Make that Calibri as well. Oops, I clicked on the wrong thing. And make that white. And I might make it a little bit bigger, maybe 32. Doesn't have to be too big, but it should be visible. All right, so now as we're going through, the next thing is the rubrics. That's really the last thing that we've got. Rubrics, which we'll put under Calibri, and I'm going to put that under, I don't know, maybe 60. Italics, doesn't need to be bold. Bold might work well. Center it, and yeah, let's change that color. But you can change it maybe to like a red, because rubrics are red. Now, the line breaking and everything, like here, we got baptism on one line. Don't worry about that right now. You'll want to worry about that when you export it, but this is just an example. So if you see this line break, I'm tempted to say, well, let's make that, maybe 48 so it all fits on one line, or maybe 72 so it breaks better. Don't worry about that, because you'll have that option later on, and there'll be other rubrics that just because this breaks nicely doesn't mean the next one will. So look at it from a stylistic perspective. One more thing I'm going to do, I find that sometimes the captions and the body run together. I'm going to go back to the caption, and I'm going to change this to kind of a lighter blue. So it's still able to be read, but it distinguishes it. All right, this is kind of a modern design. I like this. I'll hit save. Now that I've saved my basic, this will be my basic font, and I can change it and say, basic, modern, something like that. close out of this formats, and we'll go take a look at what my service looks like. Well, that's not too bad. Some of these things might be a little bit small, but that's all right. Some of these may not actually fit correctly. Our developers have tried to make it so that it breaks appropriately, and in most cases it does, but it doesn't always work. And so there will be a little bit of cleanup at the end. I can tell you that there's a lot of math that goes into it in adjusting text boxes, and so you'll get some things that aren't perfect. That's what the end is, to clean it up. But I think this looks better than before. Certainly it's going to be easier to read with it being on the white on the black. So let's go ahead and download this, and then we'll take a look at a few more options. But I'm going to go ahead and download this. So I go to Document and then Export and PowerPoint. I also have the option to do Media Shout 6. I'm not as familiar with that. We've just recently released this. And what I found is that it requires enough graphics that it doesn't work well for streaming live, at least not on my computer. So I'm not going to open that today. But I'll show PowerPoint. And sometimes, because I have a PowerPoint going, this causes some problems. So bear with me if it does. So far, it's looking okay. There it is. I'm going to drag it to my desktop and then reopen it. So far, that's going well. Okay. So it's in pretty good shape. Sometimes, depending on your formats, it's a little bit different. Like you'll notice here, this wants to add in a footer text. You've got this line there. Don't worry about that. That won't show in the presentation. Let's just go ahead and click Present. Oops, where did my mouse go? There we go. Let's see how that looks. All right, well, that's not too bad. Oh, there's the PowerPoint error. I told you guys sometimes I have problems with that. All right, when I'm presenting live, yeah, now my Builder presentation disappeared too, or for the webinar. I apologize for that. Again, when I'm presenting live, sometimes PowerPoint doesn't like to work, but we'll continue on. I want to show you a couple more things. I've got at least one question in the queue. Let's see here. I'm going to need to get back to that in just a moment. Let me go ahead and open that and we'll close. Sorry for the trouble on that. All right, got that back mostly. So let me show you a few other options for style, and then we'll kind of wrap up from there. So back under Bulletin Presentations. Actually, I can just switch it here. This is my one that I just made. I made a couple others before. One of them is that I called Pentecost Green Modern. It's very similar to what I made before. It's a different font, different color schemes, but a lot of the same practices. Oops. So in this case, my format had the stanza numbers in there. And you can see I made a slightly lighter green. So that gives you a little bit of an idea. Again, that's very similar to one I created. But I also have one that is green, more traditional. And so I'll click on that. Now this one has an image in the background, and we use what's called a serif font. And so it's still similar where it's dark, but it has the white text to make it a little bit easier to read. Let me go here under presentation formats to show you something else. So I'm going to refresh my screen because this is a different size, and sometimes the preview in presentation format doesn't work well when you're switching between different sizes. That looks a little bit better. Let me close this down here. So you'll notice that this has this kind of symbol down here. That's part of the background image. And you can choose to say, well, don't cover up the symbol ever. Here we go, something like this, just by changing your margins. Now in this case, I didn't change it, and it worked out well in this presentation here. But I have another one, this 21st Sunday after Pentecost, very specific to this service, that has this image here. So you'll notice I did a right margin of 650 to allow that image to show. So now when we get to the hymn, it's mostly to the left. It's still a very big screen, so you can see everything, but it doesn't cover up that image. Now, these backgrounds come from a product that we have that many of you have, I know as well, called Creative Worship. And Creative Worship provides you with images to be more creative, obviously the name. And so this is an example. I'll zoom in a little bit. We show the disc because it's been on discs for years. It's moving online. This is our online version. So every single Sunday has a different image that is the theme. And when you click and choose the service, you can see the different backgrounds. This is the one I used on the second one I showed you. This is the one I use with what we call digital paraments. So you've got a number of different options there. Now, we do have some images that you can use and put into your presentation. That is not done in Builder. That would be done under your PowerPoint or MediaShout or whatever you're using. So I think I've got a question about that. We'll answer that in just a moment. So that is the bulk of my presentation. I'm going to go ahead and go back here to my screen now that I've got my PowerPoint open again after PowerPoint crashed. And I'm going to go right back to this screen here before we take some questions. So if you haven't already started your free trial of Lutheran Service Builder or don't have a subscription, would like to start, go to lutheranservicebuilder.com, and I'll go back to my web browser real quick. I have it pulled up here. Just hit the Start Free Trial button, and this will take you to a sign-up page, and it's really easy to get started. And that'll take you, actually, you can go, I'm already signed in because of that. It'll take you to a sign-up page if you're not signed in. All right, now, if you are using Lutheran Service Builder 2 and you're ready to move to the online version, you can set up a time to talk with our software consultant and they'll get you moved over. I'll put this link in the chat as well for all of you to click on, but you can type it in from here. What this will do is that you'll schedule a quick 10-minute call with a software consultant, and they'll send you a new license agreement. They'll update your subscription dates if you need them aligned. So let's say you have a builder license and a hymn license and they start and end on different days. We'll align those to make it easier for everybody involved. We'll turn on your access to the new builder and they'll send you instructions on how to get started. There is no additional fee to move online. It's the same as Lutheran Service Builder 2. We just may update your dates, which might require some back pay or credit, something like that. But otherwise, the annual pricing is the same. And that also is a great time for you to ask any question and answers, but so is right now. And so I'm going to put this up on the screen, my contact information, while I take a look at your questions. And feel free to submit any more at this time. We've got a few more minutes before we wrap up, and it looks like I've got, maybe 3 or 4 questions here. So Kevin is asking, there are multiple people working on rotation on our slides. If I change a presentation format and save it, does it only affect me or the other users at our church? Kevin, that's a great question. It does affect other users, but I can give you a couple examples of how you might use it. So you said, let's see, presentation formation. I'm not exactly sure if you mean the format or the presentation itself, but the answer actually does apply to both. Let's start with formats first. In this case, I have just a general green, can be used during the season of Pentecost. In this case, it's a very specific Sunday. What you can do is you could copy this format and say, all right, well, if it's a rotation, somebody's working on the 21st Sunday and somebody's working on the 22nd Sunday, you can go through here and say, all right, this next one will be the 22nd Sunday. Let's go ahead and modify that view. So we'll change the presentation format. And then your service will be on Pentecost 22. That'll be separate from that. But if you have multiple people working on the same presentation and the same presentation format, so let's say you have multiple people working on the 21st Sunday after Pentecost, and they are both working and modifying this green traditional format, those changes will impact the other people. So if they're working on it at the exact same moment, whatever change goes in first will take effect and you'll see some weird back and forth. That's just the nature of working on a document simultaneously. But if they're working on different services or modifying different presentation formats, it won't affect the other person. It just depends on which one you're using. All right, the next question, Pastor Carl Frank, great last name, Pastor. How do you, let's see, how do you out in first slide with date and what divine service you are using? Okay, that is a good question. So how do you put out in the first slide? Like here, we start this one with just the hymn. Now you might want to insert something different. So you could say, in this slide, I'm going to insert my heading, or insert a heading. So you could go in here and say, let's see, Sunday, what did we say that was? October, it's the 21st Sunday after Pentecost, October 14th, 2018, the 21st Sunday after Pentecost. Oh, there we go. You could do something like that where you insert a heading. You could also insert a caption if you'd prefer the caption formatting. Although that, in this case, probably doesn't work. We'll just copy the text. So you could do that in there. The other thing you can do, oops, takes a second. I don't know why that's not saving. There we go. So you could do something like that. That probably doesn't look as good as the first one, although I don't know if you need the crosses. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it might be to just do it when you put it out in PowerPoint. And there's going to be some things like that. So yeah, that's my current one. So you might, like if the pastor, or you are a pastor, Pastor Frank, if you want to put different bullet points and stuff, you wouldn't do that in Builder, but you could add that in after the fact in your PowerPoint. So you've got a couple different options there. The heart of what Lutheran Service Builder does is the order of service. And then anything around that, you've got some options. All right. So Claudia's saying, is it possible to separate the introit so the pastor and the congregation can alternate each line? Well, presently there is not without some manual effort. And there's a couple different ways of doing that. Let's do that. And that's the last question I have. So I'll wrap up with this. Let's go down to the introit. So right now, the only template options we offer are to have just the individual person adding it. And that's because it's very kind of dynamic, saying which verse goes to which verse. What you can do is you can go and modify this as either a My Worship resource. So you might, let's see, yeah, I'm used to doing it on the bulletin side. You might want to go to the bulletin side and copy that and then create a new resource under My Worship resources. This is getting a little advanced. The other thing you might want to do is put that in, just update that in PowerPoint. Now we are looking at an option of finding some more responsorials for things like the introit, where it alternates and does it systematically, but we don't have that right now, and that wasn't in Builder 2 either. So that's one of the things we're considering for future implementation. It's obviously quite a bit of custom work, both on your end right now or on our end to programmatically put that in there. But we've had a number of requests for it, and so that's why we're considering that. So there's no time frame right now, although we're strongly considering that for after the first of the year. There are a number of things coming up before that that are taking priority. So it's a great question. You're not alone in asking for that. We just don't have a easy solution right now, although there's ways of doing that. So yeah, that's the last question I have. So let me go back to my screen here. We are right at our time, or slightly over. So I want to thank you for attending today. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to watch this presentation. And I hope that it was useful to you as you go about creating a presentation for your worship services. Thanks so much. Have a great day.